Ready? Yanis, very happy that you're with us today. Let me just introduce you to the audience properly. Yanis Varoufakis is a member of the Hellenic Parliament. He has been Finance Minister of Greece in 2015, in the year of the debt crisis. And he's a co-founder of Democracy in Europe Movement 25, DM25, which is a transnational organization for, let's say, a more democratic Europe through a new European constitution. Yanis Varoufakis is also co-founder of Progressive International, a global progressive organization. And he's, as he likes to say, is a politician by necessity, because by choice he's an academic. He's a professor of economics at the University of Athens. He taught for several years at the University of Sydney in Australia. And he was trained as a mathematician, actually. He has a Master of Science degree in mathematical statistics from the University of Birmingham before switching for a PhD from the University of Essex in the UK. And actually, Yanis, you are the few truly global public intellectuals. And so I'm very happy you found the time to talk to us today. And you're the author of several books on economics, inequality, and society, the most famous of which is probably Odals in the Room, a memoir on the 2015 crisis. And today we are talking of your latest book, Another Now, which is a science fiction book this time. Basically, you at some point in 2008, this parallel universe departs from our own. And in this other parallel universe, basically capitalism is substituted by a different systems, a systems that is, let's say, market economy without capitalism. And this is just a nice literary device for you to express your vision about the alternative world that you would like to have. So the first question is very easy for me. Let's say, why did you choose this literary device to express your ideas on the alternative world that you would like to see?
Well, Giuseppe, when one writes about the present, it is quite straightforward to write it as an essay and to say, this is how the system works, in my view. This is how money functions. This is how banks work. This is the reason why we have a crisis. You put forward hypotheses, you describe, and you can speak in the present tense. I believe X, Y, Z is going on today, here and there. All right, and then you can be judged on the basis of how well your hypothesis resonates with the data and with what your audience or readers have experienced. But when it comes to answer the question, okay, how could things have been differently? How could we have organized economic, social, political, moral life differently? Effectively, you're being asked to produce a utopia. Now, the problem with that, if one is truly honest with oneself, is that you really have no clue. And not only do you have no clue, but if you're intellectually curious and totally honest with yourself, you'll find yourself in disagreement with yourself about how things should be. You come up with an idea, you say, oh, maybe we should not be doing this and we should be doing the other. Like, for instance, one of the ideas in the book is that we should have no share markets. So if you don't have share markets, what do you have? How do you distribute savings amongst competing business opportunities and endeavors? So you come up with an idea and then you think, yeah, but hang on a second, this is pretty dumb. Because if we do it this way, then we have this problem. So a genuine intellectual engagement with writing a blueprint for a utopia means that you are going to have doubts and you're going to have discussions with yourself. So it's very difficult to write it as an essay where you say, I believe X, Y, or Z. If I were to write it that way, first I would be bored. And secondly, very soon I would have to write another essay denouncing my first essay. But, and this is the beauty of a novel, if you have characters, you are allowed to have this conversation with yourself, or project this conversation with yourself onto your characters. So I have three main characters in Another Now, as you know, because you kindly have read it. Thank you for this. I'm always pleasantly surprised when people like you read what I do. Very pleasantly.
I enjoyed it also.
Very surprised. So, I have, I needed to have somebody who rejects the notion that there can be something better than capitalism. So I have a neoliberal ex-banker economics professor. I've met many of these people. I've worked with them. I like a lot of them. In academic economic departments, the vast majority are like that. I've taught that kind of stuff myself. So I have a great affinity, even though that I don't agree with this neoliberal, libertarian, free marketeer perspective. But somebody had to be there to pass judgment on what I was putting forward. And that's Eva. Then there is the Marxist feminist radical who is a pessimist and feels completely defeated, like the left is usually around the world, like I feel defeated. And she's looking at this blueprint through this, lens of the defeated left who wants it and at the same time doesn't like it, and just constantly moans and groans about it, like most leftists do, right? Yeah. And then there is Costa, who is closer to you, to your discipline. He's an engineer. He's a tech enthusiast who believed as a young man that the internet and digital technologies will liberate us. But then through the experience of working in corporations, in big tech, he became disillusioned, and while remaining enthusiastic about technology, he's also absolutely terrified by how technology is being used by big tech. So these are three characters, for me, capture the three varieties of modernity that have failed. The left, failure. The liberals, neoliberals, free marketeers, failure. The techies, failure. But out of these failures, comes the hope of a realistic utopia, one that it's worth imagining and fighting for. And then, of course, they have arguments amongst themselves, which allows me to express the different doubts that I have about my own beliefs.
Yeah. No, you're right. I really identify with Costa during my reading of your book. And also, reading your book, one can see that you really like technology, because also the new world is completely based on new technologies, because otherwise it would not be possible. And we will come to that. But also you say very clearly that according to you, what we live now is a technofeudalism, right? Mm-hmm. And also this is something that is expressed by Costa in very clear terms in the book. Why do you think we are in a technofeudalism now?
Giuseppe, when I was young, a long, long time ago, I remember how exciting it was to participate in debates between the left and the right. And the traditional right, conservative, free market, liberal position was that the best way of organizing life is through a decentralized decision-making mechanism, which is the market. And the beauty of the market is that when you are in it, you are free as one can be. You are free to choose between competing products as a consumer sovereignty. As a producer, you can try your own thing, and it's a Darwinian process. Successful products will survive, unsuccessful ones will perish. Competition ensures that everybody is free, but at the same time powerless, because no one is large enough compared to the size of the market to tell other people what to do. Because if you do tell them they have alternatives, if they're workers, they can go and work for somebody else. If they're customers, they can go and buy from someone else. So that was the defense of capitalism, that model which is based on the notion of competition, where competition is the invisible hand of Adam Smith, ensuring that no one becomes too powerful, and that in the end, greedy, self-interested acts by each one of us as consumers and producers lead to the serving of the public interest. That's, I think, a pretty fair description of the defense of capitalism. And then, of course, the left, who's arguing that, since Karl Marx at least, that once you have commodified labor and the market for money, you end up with an oligarchy, which generates crisis and wastes whole generations, unemployment and so on. And therefore, you need to have a kind of non-market central planning mechanism by which to distribute resources. That debate was fascinating. And as a left-winger, I was always more fascinated with the arguments of the other side. So the view of capitalism as a decentralized, market-based decision-making process. Now, that debate remains very interesting, but it is utterly irrelevant since 2008, because that competitive market decentralized decision-making process is no longer with us. Before 2008, it was still plausible to talk in those terms of competitive markets, and also to think in terms of the state and the market. The market works on its own. The state simply provides the rules so that I do not steal from you, and if I do steal from you, the police grabs me, and therefore the market is protected from the state by the law. But the state keeps to itself, and it is simply a night's watchman, a policeman. That view is utter rubbish now, because from 2008 onwards, if it wasn't for the state printing rivers, Amazons of money with which to flood the commercial banks and the corporate sector, capitalism would have died. 2008 was a major crisis for capitalism. Capitalism would never have survived if it wasn't for the central banks, the Fed, the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and of course the European Central Bank in our case, printing and printing and printing and printing. So it's state money that keeps capitalism alive. And with technologies that are generating immense, not just economies of scale, but economies of scope as well. Think of, Google. There's no way any search engine now can compete with Google. There's no way that you can, even if you and I were to create a fantastic software competing with Facebook, no one is going to come to our Facebook because they're already in the other Facebook and their friends in the other Facebook. So it's impossible for anyone to compete with Facebook because they've become a natural monopoly. Amazon is another example. So these are gigantic platforms, not just sellers. They're not monopolies anymore. They have something much more than that. So the moment you enter Facebook, you exit the market. You enter an environment, an ecosystem, a digital ecosystem that belongs to one person, Mr. Zuckerberg. And it is the equivalent, as I like to say, because I think that makes sense to me at least, it's the equivalent of walking on a street, commercial street, in Pisa, in Milano, in Athens, wherever, and realizing that every shop belongs to one person. Whatever is being sold is regulated by that one person. All the prices are regulated by that one person. Okay, the street on which you walk, the asphalt on which you walk, the bench on which you sit to relax, the trees on the street, the air you breathe, everything belongs to one person. That's not capitalism. That's not the market. So, on the one hand, the complete dependence on state-produced money, the money tree of the central banks, and on the other hand, the fact that there is an absence of real competition. This means that we are closer to a world that resembles feudalism with very beautiful, wonderful technologies. That's why I call it technofeudalism.
So, okay, I see. The sense is that a large projection of the world, a large part of the world has been privatized company by company from this big, let's say. So, actually, the real companies that are worrying you are the really big one, the Google, the Facebook, the Microsoft, those ones, not the smaller companies.
Actually, it's worse. It's not just them. If you look at the list of companies in the New York Stock Exchange, and you look at them one by one, 90% of them, of all companies in the New York Stock Exchange, belong to three companies.
Yeah.
BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Three companies, and most people have never heard of them. They own all the airlines. So what kind of competition is there between airlines if they're all owned by the same company? Is it any wonder that airline price tickets are the same? Whether you fly Delta or United, it's the same price ticket, more or less, with some tiny variations depending on the packages and the product differentiation. It's like Procter & Gamble producing 30 different types of soap powder. You go into the supermarket and there are 30 different types of soap powder, each one with a different brand name. But if you look at the small print, they all belong to Procter & Gamble. Yeah. That's not competitive capitalism.
Yeah. Oh, I see the point. Let's go to the other now, and for those that have not read books, discuss how it works, at least the basic things. Because I anticipated the fact that there is this market economy without capitalism. Essentially, there are no investment banks, no stock market, no derivatives market, of course, and every citizen has his own personal capital account, which consists of three components, right? One is a form of universal basic income. Just because you're a citizen, you receive some, let's say, some money every month or every week. And then there are also other two pieces of the personal capital. Something that is related to the work that you do, and not just the work, but also some what is called the accumulation part. It's work plus the bonus, right? And then there is the legacy account. So how are they built together?
Well, look, let's not spend too much time on the technicalities because the reader will see them. Okay. But look, the essence here is this: my project. Besides telling a story based on science fiction, right? But in terms of political economy now, my project was to answer a question: can we have markets without capitalism? Can we democratize the economic sphere? Retaining markets, but getting rid of the sources of exorbitant power of corporations and banks. Now, how do I define capitalism? Because you see, most people out there believe that capitalism is market system. That's not what capitalism, from my perspective. I mean, every society, ancient Rome had markets, but it was not capitalist. The Phoenicians were great traders. The Silk Route existed, centuries before capitalism. Ancient Athens had markets. So what makes capitalism capitalism? It's not the market. It is the fact that labor, the labor process, and to some extent land, but primarily money, is controlled through the market. That's what makes capitalism, the labor market in particular, right? Now, before capitalism, you were either born into the ruling class and that's it. You never had to work, really. You had slaves or you had peasants doing the work, and you owned land, or you conquered it. You formed an army to take it. You didn't go through to a real estate agent to get it. So there was no market for land and there was no market for labor. If you were a worker, it means that you were born into a class of peasants and you worked. And then at the end of the season, the baron or the lord sent the sheriff and collected part of your produce. And that's what it was. But with capitalism, you have the commodification of labor. People sell their labor. And they are free to do so, but also, if they don't do so, they starve. So their freedom is filtered through the market. So the question, intellectually speaking, can there be markets with capitalism, without capitalism, translates into a slightly more precise question. Can we have corporations, markets, production, sales, without a labor market? Now, the only way you can do away with the labor market is that if you and I own a company and we're partners, then I'm not employing you, you're not employing me, we are just partners, and we do not receive wages. What we receive is a share of the profits. Then there's no labor market. Now, imagine a world where everybody who works for a company is an owner, an equal owner, right? So how does that work? You get hired by a corporation. That corporation may have 1,000 people in it or 300 people, doesn't matter how many people. If they like you, the people who interview you from this corporation, the hiring committee, the search committee, you enter you're hired. And the moment you're hired, you get one share. Like when you go to University of Pisa as a student, students who enroll at the University of Pisa, they get a library card. Yeah. That library card allows them to do stuff. Buy books, borrow books, participate in lectures through your teleconferencing system, especially now during the pandemic and so on. But that library card, you cannot sell it and you cannot rent it. And you cannot have more than one. It comes with the job. It comes, being enrolled at the university or working for Corporation X. So imagine that was the only share that existed. One share, one worker, one vote in decision-making processes within the companies. You still have a corporation, except now the shareholders are the people working for them, and everybody gets the same, in the same way that every voter in the political process has one vote. And it doesn't mean that we are all the same. Some people have, more sophisticated political views than others. Some are more politically active than others. Others don't care about, politics at all, and they don't even vote, but they have the right to one vote. They don't have more votes just because they're cleverer or richer or more powerful. Now imagine you had a situation like that. And so I was trying to imagine, how would that market society work if corporations, the ownership, the property rights of corporations, the shares of corporations were distributed only to the people who were working in them? Well, immediately, come to think of it, the moment you have this kind of deal or social contract, suddenly share markets die. There are no share markets. Because if you are not selling them and buying them, there can be no market for them. Then immediately the thought came to me that that would be a real revolution regarding banking. Because if you look at banks, Unicredit in Italy, Santander, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America. Now, a tiny proportion of what they do have to do with you. Rank and file member of the public that has an account with Unicredit. Most of what banks do is effectively they bet on the stock exchange, or they lend money to other people to bet on the stock exchange, or buy derivatives, which are what? Bundles of different shares or options to buy shares. So if you take out tradable shares, then the banking system we have now disappears. Now, that might sound like a crisis. What would we do without banks? Well, then you realize, why do we really need banks in capitalism today? We need banks today because it's the only way of making payments. So if you want to buy a book, on Amazon or some kind of platform, or if you want to go to a local cafeteria and use your card to buy a cup of cappuccino, right? Now, your money is with a private bank. Your card or app on your phone is going to work through that bank, and then that bank is linked to another bank belonging to that has where the cafeteria owner has an account, and your €2 will go from your bank account. So the payment system is privately owned now, due to these banks. Most of the profits of those banks do not come from your payments. It comes from the share market. So what could the alternative be? Well, all our bank accounts are now digital. Now, Santander, Unicredit, I don't know if there is a Banca di Pisa. I'm sure there is, or there is, or
Something similar.
Something similar, right? They all have a bank account with the European Central Bank, with the Banca d'Italia, which is, of course, the European Central Bank. Now, the European Central Bank, in principle, could provide each one of us with a digital bank account. It's completely straightforward. There's nothing technically complicated about that. And, we could have an app to make payments. We could have a card. There's no reason why we should have a bank account with a commercial bank in order to make payments. The payment system could be an expanded version of Target 2, the payment system of the European Central Bank, similarly in Britain, similarly in the United States. So suddenly we realize once we do away with the share markets, we've done away with the labor market, because effectively all employees share profits. They don't have employers and employees. They're all employers and employees at the same time, since they own the corporation. So there are no labor markets. There are no wages and profits. It's just residuals that are being shared, net revenues that are being shared. Suddenly, there's no need to have banks, because the central bank can do the job. And that's when the next idea comes in about the universal basic income that you mentioned. Because, look, as we speak, only in the few months since the pandemic began, the European Central Bank printed 2 trillion euros. They've already done it. They've printed 2 trillion euros. Only the last year or so, 13 months. Since the 1st of March of 2015, when Mario Draghi started it, with QE, quantitative easing, they've produced upward of 7 trillion euros. So it's not that they're not printing it. The money tree exists. We don't need to invent it. It's there. It's producing. We're harvesting money from the European Central Bank, just like the Americans are harvesting from the Federal Reserve, the Brits from the Bank of England, the Japanese from the Bank of Japan, the Swiss from the Bank of Switzerland, and so on. Well, where is all this money going? The ECB money. It's going to private banks. The idea is that during the pandemic, during the difficult times of the Euro crisis and so on, the banks like UniCredit is going to lend it to you to start a business. But UniCredit is never going to lend it to you, because it looks at you and says, yeah, right, he's never going to make money, sufficient money to repay me. So instead, they give it to Fiat. They give it to Alstom. They give it to Siemens. They give it to Volkswagen, who are already sitting on a pile of cash, and they are not investing it because they're fearful that Giuseppe and Yanis are not going to be able to buy their stuff. So what does, Fiat, Alstom, Siemens, and so on do with the money that they get from the central bank via the commercial bank? They go to the stock exchange and buy their own shares. So their share price goes up. They do very well because their director's pay is linked to the share price, but no investment takes place. So the money is wasted. So if we cut out the middleman, and the central bank simply, if you and I have, all of us, if we have accounts with the central bank, well, just put the money in there directly into people's accounts as a UBI, a universal basic income. And suddenly, because come to think of it, it's like the central bank will be like a big Excel. A big Excel. There's a row for Giuseppe, a row for Yanis, a row for the cafeteria, a row for Fiat, and so on. So when you buy something of me, of the cafeteria, numbers migrate from one cell to another cell, right? And to the extent that production takes place as a result, production of coffee, of cars, of, electronics lectures, or lectures on electronics, whatever it is that you're providing the world with, right? The economy is moving. And if the central bank thinks that there is too sluggish economic activity, they can give us a little bit more money. If they think that the economy is overheating, they can reduce it. So macroeconomic management policies are much easier, much more straightforward, because now they really don't know what's going to happen. If they give more money to UniCredit, is this going to trickle down to the economy? They have no idea. It usually doesn't. So macroeconomic management becomes easier. And in the end, you have the elimination of feudalism. Because if ownership, in the end, goes to those who work in companies, You're never going to have huge companies because, let's face it, there is an optimal size of a company. If we are all voting for big decisions, we're not going to have a company with, 1 million people. We will not want it. If our company, if you, me, and another 1,000 people have a company, and we are growing much more, maybe we will split. There will be 2 companies, so that decision making could be optimal. We will decide that. We have no reason to have a company where there are 1 million of us. We're not going to gain anything as individuals. So that's how the thinking behind another now's political economy, banking, labor markets, or the elimination of labor markets, corporate law, evolved as I was writing the book.
So you see basically you see it as a big simplification of all the complexity of the world, which is basically really not needed, not necessary. Let me just ask.
It's more than that, Giuseppe. It's more than just the complexity. It is removing the complexity which creates feudal-like power in our world, and therefore causing huge inequalities, a great deal of discontent, and economic failure.
Okay, I see. Just to verify if I have understood correctly, basically your companies, the new companies would be like partnerships, basically. Yes. Because in a partnership you have one person, one vote, and basically, as you said before, the partnership typically does not become let's say a huge mega company because there's an optimal size. But do you think that this might be an issue, for example, because sometimes big companies are really required to tackle big projects, really big ones, so as for example building an airport, building some huge telecom infrastructure and so on. Or so for some big challenges you really need big companies.
I don't think we do. This is where new technologies come in, because the building of instead of thinking of one company building an airport, break down the various parts of building an airport, and you have many smaller or medium-sized companies. They don't have to be very small. One is building the runway, the other is building the electronics, the other one is building the catering, and you can have alliances between companies, which you normally do anyway, even under capitalism. What you do away with is Amazon, because Amazon now is destroying whole marketplaces. Little towns, small towns, large towns, Amazon is now wrecking them. And it's doing it at a global level. So what is the value added of this? The ideology of cheapness, that everything must be as cheap as possible. But in the end, when everything is as cheap, it becomes really nasty as well. And it has, environmental effects. And it reduces the local content, which adds the flavor. Because if you take away from publishing, the local novels, from music, the local talent, and everything is crushed, and musicians in Pisa can never make any money because Spotify and Amazon never allow them to make any money because they crush them through their sheer size and power. It will. Many wonderful music that would have been produced otherwise will never be produced.
I see. In those cases, I see very clearly, because as you mentioned, Amazon basically has, let's say, aggregated together a business which was used to be performed by several smaller companies. And that is probably the same for Spotify and similar ones. But my feeling is that probably you also lose some big companies, not maybe as big as Amazon, that might be required for tackling big projects. This is something sort of, let's say, doubt that I have.
Yeah. Look, I have doubts too. Let's have them. The more doubts we have, the smarter we will become. But if you think of NASA going to the moon in the 1960s, how many employees do you think they had? Not that many. It wasn't that many. They had other companies working for them that they subcontracted stuff. But NASA itself, there were 3,000 people. Now, they could work on the basis of... And you see, the new technologies that we have, the new algorithms, the new methods of aggregating information and aggregating opinion and consulting allow for a partnership to work very smoothly. I've actually worked in one of those companies, and this is where a lot of my inspiration comes from. Back in 2012, in a company in Seattle, which was, it was not many people. It was about 350 people, but they had a gigantic revenue stream of $1.2 billion a year, right? And they operated on the basis of this kind of decentralized decision-making. It was a bossless firm. Anyone who's, worked on the project of their choosing. You had spontaneous teams forming and being creative. And when that company also worked with much larger studios in Hollywood and so on. So they participated in large-scale projects like the one you mentioned. Once you have voting mechanisms, electronic voting mechanisms, that you simply touch a button. You don't need the long assemblies and meetings, staff meetings that they needed to have in Yugoslavia under Tito during the self-management period, which was a very interesting experiment, by the way, and to some extent successful, right? But today, all that would be very efficient with electronic voting. And let's not forget that the beauty of this is that members of the company, shareholders, partners, would have a right to vote, but not an obligation to vote. Because, this is a very important distinction. You have the right to vote, but you just vote on the things that you know something about and you care about.
You care about.
You don't need to vote about everything.
Yeah. Yeah, the company you're mentioning is Valve, right? Is
Valve.
That Valve, right? I read on your Wikipedia page, I read it actually. And this Valve is the owner of the Steam gaming platform, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, no, I'm mentioning this because when I read your book, one thing that came to mind is that this, let's say, design of another word would be perfect for a massively multiplayer simulation game. because in that case, you can really try to see some rules and then some emerging mechanism at play if some new things that you did not expect before can emerge from the people playing the game of this other world. I don't know if you given your experience you ever thought it that way, but I think it would be a beautiful massively a multiplayer game because sometimes my idea is simply that sometime let's say things emerge that you do not plan in advance, and then you set up the rules, but when you let the rules run, sometimes let's say people start to behave in a way that you do not expect, and so on. And so according to you, what do you think is let's say, do you think that this type of system can easily autocorrect, and because sometimes things do not, are not, do not go in the direction that we expect? For sure, I think that the point of keeping companies not too large is a way of autocorrecting, because we have seen that if things becomes too large, then, for example, their failure can be a system problem, a system size problem. So that is a good thing. But do you see other aspects that enable autocorrection of the mechanism that you envision?
Absolutely, endogenous stability is what we see, right? As opposed to exogenous interventions where the state comes and says, "Oh, I'm now going to split the company up," because that is a form of violence by the state. Look, in the book, I tried to imagine the extent to which the system that I imagined, would be able to absorb shocks. That would it generate shocks? A crisis, an endogenous crisis, and like capitalism does. If it did, what kind of crisis would I anticipate, and how well would it absorb it? So in one of the chapters, I tell the story of the crash of 2022 in the other now, in the market socialist now. So the story goes, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it, but the idea here is I created in my mind a financial crisis, even though there are no banks. And the financial crisis that I imagined took place because there will always be people who try to use arbitrage. Even if we all have a bank account with a central bank and we don't need banks, there will be some people who will have savings and other people who will want to borrow those savings. And that is a good thing. And there will be brokers, people who aggregate information. And if you have savings, they will try to match you up with somebody who needs your savings to play the role of the go-between. And so I created a crisis by having some very smart people trying to game the system by creating a futures market, very much like what we had go wrong in 2008. And then I tried to imagine how would that system respond to this crisis and how would it absorb it. So, in my mind, of course, because I'm biased regarding this particular political economy that I imagine, the system had a spasm, there was a lot of anxiety, there was social strife, like there usually is if there's a systemic crisis. So there was a systemic crisis, but I try to explain how I think the lack of a banking system, the lack of financial capital, and the lack of the labor contract, the labor market, created better shock absorbers for the system.
I see. There's another issue. The fact that, let's say, another world exists and it is possible, but we are in this world now, does not automatically gives us a way to go from here to there. Of course, in the book, the world basically exploits the 2008 crisis. But also in that case, it's not an easy task because in your novel, basically there is a high degree of coordination in let's say boycott activities that brings down the banks, the utilities, Facebook, and so on, in order to move to this other market without banks, without stock market, and so on. But that for me is the most difficult part. Let's say the part which seems to me much more difficult. Do you think there's actually a way? Because we are in another crisis now in practice. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on this point?
Well, I have to confess that the chapter in which I describe how in the other now, after 2008, we went through the transition to a post-capitalist world, to a market socialist world. In other words, the story of the revolution, my theory of change and the way I narrated the practice of change. That was the hardest one to write. You can imagine that, right?
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to give away the story, but I'll just mention that the way it happens is that a number of people who were working in Wall Street, who became very disillusioned, and I know people who worked in Wall Street and who did become very disillusioned, financial engineers to be precise. Imagine if instead of simply taking drugs and going to bed at night, crying themselves to sleep, as many of them did, or joining Occupy Wall Street for a few weeks until they went home. Imagine if they were so pissed off, excuse my French, regarding what happened. And so I have the leader of the revolution, it's called Esmeralda. She used to work for Lehman Brothers in my imagination. And she sends an email to fellow financial engineers who lost their jobs in September of 2008 and says, do you want us to get together and bring the rest of them down? Bring the hedge funds down, because, Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke are trying to refloat them. We cannot allow this to happen again. We were used, we we're part of something really horrible, something that damaged so many millions of people. You want to join us? And then, a group of financial engineer hackers get together and they start a series of hits against the financial derivatives, therefore preventing Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and Bert Bernanke from refloating the financial derivative market. And then others spontaneously start following them. Others form different groups. They target privatized utilities with a campaign to withhold payment of utility bills and start, the whole thing especially in 2009, the financial system was extremely fragile. I have no doubt if there were these pockets of hackers or financial engineers inciting large numbers of people not to pay their bills, credit card bills, water utility bills, electricity bills, for a couple of weeks, no more than that. That would be enough to really cause a great deal of panic in government and to stop government from bailing out the bankers. And so then I imagine that the trades unions joined in Africa, people would go together, and so on. And so, yes, coordination, but it's not spontaneous coordination. It's not simultaneous coordination. It's an evolutionary process that I try to describe. So some people started. In other words, the importance of leadership.
Yeah.
The importance of some people getting together who have the know-how and practicing, Giuseppe, an idea which I think, which has been niggling at me now for a very long time. In the 19th century, when trade unions were created, the heroism of those people was unbelievable. Because think about it, back in the 1840s, 1860s, 1880s, even in the 20th century, to form a union was a major risk because, people were really very, very poor, the workers. So going on a strike meant that there was no food for their kids during the days of strike. And also they could be shot at, they could be fired, they could be vilified, and they were. So it was maximum personal sacrifice for very little private benefit. So this calculus was always against the working class. And still they did it. Okay? Still they did it. And I was thinking, right, after 2008, could we reverse the calculus? The balance. Instead of having maximum personal sacrifice for very, very small benefit, how about a movement, a campaign, a rebellion, which is based on precisely the opposite? Tiny, small sacrifices, very large benefit. This is why, as part of the Progressive International, we're going to be trying a campaign out against Amazon, where not only will warehouse workers go on strike, the traditional way that trade unions can press for their rights and wages, but also imagine a situation where you say to people, and that's in the book, of course, the idea is already in the book, that, tell the world, in support of those workers and in support of our demand for Amazon reducing its carbon footprint, on next Tuesday, nobody visit Amazon.com, just for one day. Just for one day. Yeah. If only 20% of people who would have visited Amazon, the website, on Tuesday, don't do it, that is a massive hit for Amazon. Jeff Bezos would take notice. So, and there's no private cost really to not visiting Amazon on Tuesday. I mean, that's what I mean by tiny. I'm giving an example of this reversed calculus, tiny personal sacrifice, great social benefit. So this is my kind of thinking regarding your question. How can we organize an international movement that campaigns for the change of the paradigm, of the foundations of capitalism? Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's not going to happen the old-fashioned way, with just strikes and political parties getting together and organizing, like the Communist Party of Italy used to, or, Syriza used to. We need to combine the power of consumers, especially over the internet, with our power to, to fight the war against finance on their own territory, in terms of financial engineering, with traditional forms of trade unionism, with climate protests. And I believe that people out there are fed up with the status quo. They are fed up with Tina, with the dogma that there is no alternative. And if somebody starts this process, and they can see that it combines technological expertise, love for technology, but also a complete rejection of the way technology is being used against people, against the majority, then it is possible. Not likely, possible.
Yeah. No, I see. I must say, frankly, I'm a bit skeptical about the boycotts in general, because the experience has been that they typically, they're hard at work on the one hand, because it's really hard to coordinate, let's say, a boycott. But on the other hand, for example, we have observed very recently this GameStop thing with let's say, normal people coordinating on Reddit to
there you are.
Yeah. To go against some private equity funds. So that was actually a surprise to me, just because I typically think that boycott very, very, very hard to work.
But look, I agree with you when it comes to the physical marketplace. It's very hard to organize a physical boycott, but a digital boycott is very easy, especially if people out there identify with the cause. You say to them, look, there are these workers in warehouses of Amazon in New Jersey and Bangladesh who are being run into the ground by technologies, the technologies that are being used in order to check what they do every moment of the day. And they work for awful wages, no security, completely unhygienic. You can participate in this strike against this company by not visiting their site one day. That, I think, is easy to organize. What is impossible to organize is a physical boycott. To stop people from going to their local cafeteria, to stop people from going to their, local, whatever, Prada shop, if they're rich. That's impossible to organize. But, and that's the GameStop, I think, lesson for us. That, through Reddit, through a campaign on the using social media, which goes viral, and people feel that they belong to something bigger than themselves when they don't do something for one day or 1 week. That I think is doable.
Yeah. Yanis, can I ask you, what do you think of the present crisis? How let's say, the various governments are responding to it? Because, everybody's talking about building back better or some other variations of that, and of changing things after this period. But I'm curious to know what you think. I've read an article you put out very recently on Project Syndicate regarding this aspect, and what can you tell us regarding this point?
Well, let's begin with Europe. Europe's response has been absolutely pathetic. What I find astonishing is the improvement in the propaganda of the European Union. Unlike 2010, 2011, 2012, where they were terrible at macroeconomic policy, the response to the Euro crisis was just idiotic and misanthropic. But so was their propaganda. Their propaganda was appalling. Remember when Mario Monti was coming back to Italy from Brussels? And it was all a joke. Within 2 days, everybody was laughing their head off at the incompetence of the EU. Now they've succeeded in portraying their response as brilliant, as the best we could have ever imagined from the European Union. And it is terrible. It is just as bad as it was in 2010. This recovery fund is a very poor excuse for a response, a macroeconomic response to the pandemic. So Europe is going to certainly fall behind the United States and China yet again. So remember, we had the Euro crisis. Europe was weakened vis-a-vis China and the United States. It is going to be weakened even further. The fragmentation of the European Union is continuing. More Italian national debt.
Can you expand this point? Because this time is not responding with austerity, right? Is responding with
Wait for
Okay.
it. It's going to come.
Just I'm
Not
asking you
yet.
to expand this concept. So for the moment, at least, it seems an injection of resources, basically,
What,
right?
0.6%?
Yeah.
0.6% of GDP when we have an output gap of 8%. So, you know,
Yeah.
we needed something like 8% of fiscal stimulus, and we get 0.6%. Don't listen to the 750 billion. Most of those are loans. Loans are useless when you have a massive crisis. And the austerity is going to come. But it will come only when Berlin balances its budget, right? Can I remind you that immediately after the euro was put together in 2000, the first country that broke the Maastricht rules was not Italy or Greece, it was Germany.
Yeah.
So when it suits them in Berlin, then they break the rules. And while they're breaking the rules, they cannot expect Rome or Athens or Madrid not to break them. So now they're giving Mario Draghi and Mitsotakis here in Greece, they're giving them leeway.
Yeah.
Debt is accumulating, right? Because there is no Eurobond, really. Not one penny has been spent from the recovery fund. And when the money comes, it will be puny compared to the increase in the national debt of Italy, of Greece, and Spain. So when Berlin balances its books, under a new chancellor as well, not Merkel, right? Then the email will go from Berlin to Brussels to Rome, and it will be cut down.
So you say too little, too late, and with
the wrong direction.
with a return, let's say, with a bouncing back.
And we have no investment. We have no serious investment. You know, I mean, look, the obvious thing to have done is to use the pandemic as an excuse, as an opportunity, as a trigger for creating an energy union, a renewables energy union in the European Union, and to plow, you know, trillions into it. So we have one electricity grid across the European Union, funded by Europe, you know, bolstering renewables. Instead, we still have national grids, no common plan, no great boost of investment. The money will go to the oligarchy again. You'll see who's going to get the money in Italy from the recovery fund. You will see it in Greece too. You know, poor German workers are going to be paying rich Italians and rich Greeks. This is not a very good foundation for the European Union's consolidation.
Feelings. Yeah. No, I share with you the fear that you're going to fall behind USA and China, because actually the level of investment is really too little with respect to China in particular, but also to the US, because they're moving fast and with a significant amount of money.
Also, Giuseppe, and this is an important point, I think it's the most crucial point. You know, if we were poor and we invested little, it would make sense. You know, if you're poor and you don't have savings, you don't have money, I mean, how can you invest?
Yeah.
But we're not poor. This is what drives me absolutely berserk, mad, that Europe has never had so much money in its history. Our financial system is completely stuffed with money. So this is the tragedy. Our savings or liquidity is there. Our investment is here. This gap explains why you're paying negative interest rates, because you know the savings is the supply of money, and the investment is the demand for money. So when savings exceeds constantly demand, what happens? Price falls. What's the price? The price of money, interest rates. So you've got, you know, pension groups and insurance companies being crushed by the negative interest rates, which is terrible for the future generation, right? And the money is not being invested. It's being wasted.
Can the problem be demography? We're a bit too old. We're
nothing to do with demography. It's got nothing to do with demography. This is a poor excuse. You know, it's not that there are no things to do. You know, I mean, if you go, I mean, Germany today is investing, as we speak, they're building lignite-powered electricity generating stations. This is preposterous. Lignite, the poorest form of coal, right? And they are connecting with Nord Stream 2 to get gas from Putin. Now, I mean, how stupid is this? You know, we should be building renewables. the Chinese are doing it. The Texans are doing it. If you look at the rate at which we're investing in the renewables, they're tiny. And even what we are doing is piecemeal, and it is wrong-headed here in Greece, right? I mean, I'm talking to you from an island. We have all this water, the sea out there. If you look at what the Danes or the British are doing, they've covered the sea with wind turbines. We're not doing it. We are buying old-fashioned German turbines and putting them on top of hills and mountains, which is destroying the habitat, turning the population against the turbines, and we're not using the huge amount of energy which is out there in the Aegean Sea, which could power half of Europe. But that would require a European project, not a Greek project. It would require a green energy union. So we have things that are necessary to do to save the environment, to create green jobs across Europe. We have the money to do it, and we're not doing it. This is the definition of coordination failure.
Yeah. Let me ask you one additional thing. In your vision, you always consider an international and global approach. And this is something it's a classic feature of left thinkers, thinking globally and internationally. And I would say it's also a feature of science fiction authors. But I think, of course, for some issues, it's important to think globally. For example, climate change, the change of the energy sources, but also, for example, taxation in order to avoid, for example, tax havens and so on. That requires a global thinking. But on the other hand, what we are observing also in this crisis is that, for example, there are some regional and local communities that are trying to differentiate themselves from the nation. We have seen it in Italy, we have seen it in Spain, we have seen it in Germany, also with Dr. Merkel. We have seen it in the UK. I mean, does it surprise you? Do you think it's normal? How can we try to let's say, tackle the global issues if the whole picture is so fragmented?
Well, it's funny you should say this, because the most successful internationalists are the bankers, not the left, not science fiction writers. The bankers operate on the basis of true internationalist solidarity amongst themselves. After their banks collapsed in 2008, they got together, they pushed our leaders, the G20, remember, April 2009, they met in London under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown, who was British Prime Minister at the time. And they organized a simultaneous, incredibly generous bailout of all the bankers of the world. They printed huge quantities of money. So they are thinking globally, right? So do the fascists, or neo-fascists, or nativists, or populists, call them whatever you want. Salvini and Le Pen and Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi. They have a fantastic relationship. They collaborate beautifully with one another. And then they go back to their homeland and they talk about, the national identity, and they have a nativist approach, like Donald Trump did, America first, or, Boris Johnson, or Nigel Farage, or Salvini, right? But it's all fake, because they're really very well coordinated. The only people who are not coordinated are the progressives. It's about time we started coordinating. Why? Because, you see, the tragedy is this. I do not want to live in a world, in a global village. I do not want to live in a world I am living in a global village. Whether I go to Rome or to Sydney, Australia, or Malaysia, I will find the same shop. And people will be, listening to watching the same Netflix movies. Already our regional, local cultures are being decimated by internationalism, but they're being decimated by the wrong internationalism. Mm-hmm. So if we want our local culture to flourish, we must organize internationally to defeat the globalism, which is killing off regional variations. So I'm a patriot and I'm a localist, And that is why I'm an internationalist. It is a false dichotomy to say either you care about your own community or you care about the world. People say to me, I want my village back. I've had enough of my village, not controlling my life in my village. I want my region back, you know? I want Calabria back. I want Italy back. Yes, fine, I want you to have it back. But the only way you can get Calabria back, the only way you can get Attica back, is if we organize at the European level to, you know, to have the green energy which is necessary to create good quality jobs in Calabria, in Attica. And then our local cultures will flourish as well and will not be surrendered to Netflix and Spotify.
Okay. Oh, I get your point. So I get your point. You say we can let's say it's similar to act local, think global, act global and think local. It's the same.
Indeed.
The same
Indeed.
Approach. Okay. We are past the hour. Probably we should close here. I'm looking at the comments, but actually there are comments, not really additional questions from the audience. So I really would like to thank you again. I enjoyed very much this conversation. It's been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate you spending your time with us today. And,
well, thank you. It was great fun talking about my book, and thank you. You know, it's a great honor. You know, whenever one is writing a book, especially a novel, and you know, I've never written a novel before, one feels, my God, who is ever going to care about this? So thank you for caring.
Okay, thank you very much. And we can say hello to all the people that have attended this.
Thank you, everyone, for
bye
for watching. Thank you.